Thank you. I'm gonna beat the dead horse and tell you how dams are bad for fish. We all know that it causes habitat loss and destruction, and then it segments stocks, particularly for migratory species like sturgeon and paddlefish, and that results in some genetic isolation because gene flow typically only occurs downstream. Well, we know for paddlefish that downstream passage does occur in all sorts of dam structures, and that can often result in physical injuries. And as you can see in the photos, typically that includes partial or full rostrum amputations. Well, rather than talk about the impacts of dams in general, I'm going to talk about what happens to individual paddlefish when they get injured in such a way. So in order to do that, I'm going to set the stage a little bit and talk about the rostrum real quickly. If you're unfamiliar, paddlefish have a large bill, or known as a rostrum, on the end of their head, and its primary use is for detecting plankton because they're a midwater filter feeder. That rostrum is loaded with sensory cells called ampullae of Lorenzini, which can detect the minute electrical currents generated by plankton, their primary food. Also has a secondary function. It serves as a hydrofoil, allowing them to maintain their position in the water column while they're filter feeding. And a third use could be detecting their environment. There's research shows that they can avoid obstacles in the water simply due to electrosense. And I'll go into a little more depth on these a little bit later as I talk about the costs and consequences. Paddlefish have a large range in the United States. Throughout the Mississippi and Missouri River basins, ranging all the way from Montana to New York State, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. For this talk, I'm going to restrict myself to some reservoirs in Oklahoma and Arkansas, in the Arkansas River watershed, and a major tributary, the Neosho River. Like I said, these are all reservoirs or lakes. In the Neosho River, we have 3 high dam reservoirs, Grand Lake, Hudson, and Gibson. And then in the Arkansas River, which is a navigable waterway, we have 4 reservoirs which are impounded by lock and dam structures, which do allow some passage of paddlefish upstream. As I present data on these reservoirs throughout the talk, they'll be presented in left to right fashion, where left is upstream and right is downstream. Of particular note, Grand Lake is where we have a research center and we have steady access to specimens from angler harvest, so I'm going to be using some specimens from that throughout this presentation. I'm not the first to look at paddlefish injuries. This has been going on for many, many decades. Coker back in 1930 on the Keokuk Dam, Mississippi River, demonstrated 66% amputation rate in a tail race stock. That's pretty significant. Other researchers have shown lesser, but it is a problem and it hasn't really been studied in much depth. For this study, although I have a giant sample size from these 7 reservoirs, this is still preliminary and I haven't put these data through very much of a robust statistical analyses yet, but it's an ongoing project, so I'm just going to kind of show you what we know so far. With that many fish from 2 states, we had to sort of standardize what our rostrum injuries consisted of. So as you can see from my drawings here, we had healthy, amputated, partially amputated, injured, which take a wide variety of severity, and then deformed. It's just some sort of misshapen genetic issue. We combined the injured and deformed rostrums into one category, and then we had no rostrums and short rostrums as some of our maladies here. For the 7 lakes studied in this preliminary project, we found 2 to 29% of the netting catch had rostrum issues of some sort. And as you can see, it's quite variable. In the upper end of the study area, Grand Lake, we had very low frequency. But as you continue to pass through more and more dams, you see a higher frequency of rostrum injuries, with a peak of 7.5% of rostrum amputations in Kerr Reservoir. Now that's much lower than we saw in some of those other studies, but still this is something worth investigating. And we're not simply looking at the frequency of rostrum injuries here. We want to look in a little more depth. What are the individual costs to a fish who has its rostrum amputated, and how do those costs compound into consequences for the stock? So one way we can look at the health of an individual fish is to simply calculate its relative weight. It's a fairly standard fisheries technique. Well, when you got a rostrum amputee, you know that its weight has directly been impacted by losing a body part. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to simply calculate relative weight. Well, what if you can estimate the weight of that rostrum, adjust the body weight, and then calculate an adjusted relative weight? And that's one of the things I aim to do with this study, with the prediction that within stock and within sex, we would find that the relative weight of healthy fish would generally be greater than the relative weight of amputated fish. Same goes for condition factors. So we use sort of two metrics here to evaluate the condition of these injured fish. And the basic prediction there that within the body length and weight curve, these amputated fish would typically lie below the curve. So they're not doing as well as their healthy counterparts. As I mentioned, we have a research station up on Grand Lake. That provided us a lot of angler harvested fish that we could dissect. So one of the things I chose to do was lop off some rostrums in the same fashion that they would be amputated by passing through a dam. And we did this for 118 females and 120 males. And we did a bunch of various measurements, things that are germane to this presentation. Females, typically 2.4% of their body weight is consisted of rostrum, and males approximately 3%. We didn't want to necessarily adjust the body weight simply by that percentage because we don't know what effects that rostrum loss has imparted on the individual fish. So I opted to predict rostrum weight from body length. So if you're not familiar with how paddlefish are measured, they're not measured in total length. They're measured from the eye to the fork of the tail, and that's because rostrum injuries are so common. So we generated some very simple regression models, which were used to predict rostrum weight based on the amputated fish's body length. And as I said, this is fairly statistically non-robust at this point. We don't have a lot of significant results, but we have some interesting trends here. Again, the stocks are listed upstream to downstream, and in all circumstances but one, we found that our prediction was supported by the data, that relative weight of healthy fish was greater than the adjusted relative weight of amputees. Now, this is not a big shocking revelation here. The same condition factor held true for this other metric of fish health. And condition factor did not take into account sex of the paddlefish, that's why they're combined here. Again, the healthy fish typically had a higher condition factor than the amputated fish. And when they're pulled across stocks, again, just reinforcing this point that healthy fish do better than amputees. Well, in plain terms, what this means is that your average amputee weighs almost 1 kilogram less than a healthy paddlefish. And that's not all rostrum weight. So where is that weight, and how is that affecting the fish physiologically? And that's the whole point of this presentation. So paddlefish store their energy in gonadal fat reserves. So for males on the right there, we have the testes surrounded by fatty deposits that we call gonadal fat bodies. The females are a little less defined. They have smaller fat bodies, and then they have fat embedded within the roe. An immature female will have an ovary surrounded by fat bodies in a similar fashion to the males. But these are energy reserves for paddlefish. These are really important, and we've done a lot of research on the physiology of these fish and how it affects their reproductive condition, age, etc. Well, going back to the Grand Lake stock where I have a lot of dissected fish, I've got data, I've got age, gonadal fat body weights, etc., on thousands of fish from Grand Lake. But because the frequency of rostrum amputations up there is so low, it's sort of a weak conclusion here, but 9 out of 11 amputated females and 6 out of 8 amputated males had gonadal fat body reserves at or below the average based on their age. So it's kind of a clue that potentially these reduced fat reserves are part of the consequences, part of the cost to the individual for having their rostrum amputated. So that gonadal fat reserve is affected by numerous aspects here. So an individual losing their rostrum due to a dam passage potentially has reduced foraging efficiency. As we can see here in the picture, paddlefish and sturgeon, of course, have the heterocircle tail with a large upper caudal lobe. Now, that rostrum, if you've ever stuck your hand out the car window, is an important hydrofoil for maintaining their position in the midwater as a planktivore versus a sturgeon who is benthic. So losing their hydrofoil makes it harder to maintain position in the water column where your preferred prey is. Also, there's some unpublished research showing that fish naturally with smaller rostrums have slower swimming speeds than fish with larger rostrums. So just the natural variation within the species sort of lends credence to having a shortened rostrum would have lower foraging efficiency. And the simple mathematic factor of a rostrum has a fixed number of electrosensory cells, and if you cut it in half or off completely, then you have fewer electrosensors to find your prey items. And again, losing a rostrum and the degraded electrosense could potentially impact the way they interact with their environment. There's some speculation that paddlefish may use the Earth's magnetic field. However, I don't give that a lot of credence. They do avoid electrical stimuli and obstructions in complete darkness, so having a dysfunctional rostrum may impact how they interact with their environment. But all of that sort of comes together back to the gonadal fat reserves. If they have reduced foraging efficiency, a harder time swimming, they're not going to get as much groceries as they need to build up those fat reserves, which are going to sustain them throughout their lifespan. So there's a direct link between gonadal fat reserves and lifespan for paddlefish, where when those GFBs are completely depleted, they quit spawning and they basically die. So if they're depleting those GFBs at a higher rate, or they're unable to accumulate GFBs, then it could potentially impact their lifespan. And then the important point of all this is that it can result in reproductive dysfunction. There's published studies linking fecundity, spawning interval, and migration distance all to resources, food availability. So it makes perfect sense that food availability and reduced foraging efficiency would lie on the same playing field. So fish with reduced foraging efficiency are likely going to have lower fecundity. They're not going to spawn as often, and if they have smaller fat reserves, they would mimic the younger females, the older females, which do not migrate as far. So there's a lot of links there between energetics and how they perform their reproductive functions. So given these costs to the individual, now I kind of put it into sort of a conspiracy theory where all this stuff combines into consequences for the stock for paddlefish. So we have a fish that passes through a dam, potentially gets injured. Of course, we're ignoring the whole fact that some of them die as well. As I've demonstrated, potentially has reduced foraging efficiency, generating much smaller fat reserves, potentially leading to a shorter lifespan. Meanwhile, that rostrum injury is also imparting some swimming limitations, which sort of interfaces back in with reduced foraging efficiency and potentially causing shorter migration distances, which also relates to smaller fat reserves. So fish with smaller gonadal fat reserves migrate shorter distances. And the proximity to prime spawning habitats, that could be an important factor to consider. Both shorter migration distances and shorter lifespan are going to reduce the stock recruitment potential. So this is kind of a big deal, especially for paddlefish, which are a state-managed fish. They are valuable for recreational harvest and commercial harvest. So as a state manager, one of my concerns is harvest sustainability. Well, if we have a bunch of unknown mortality factors and recruitment factors simply due to the fact that paddlefish are injured through passing through a dam, then that's something we need to sort of look into in a little more depth. So, conclusions. This is not a reasonable conclusion. I know that we're tearing down some dams in sturgeon habitat. However, in the heart of the country where we have paddlefish, that's not a viable solution. In fact, they're trying to put in more dams in my state. So realistically, the fish are going to continue to get injured. However, for future dam projects or retrofits, hopefully we're generating the knowledge these days to make reasonable suggestions to modify the structures in such a way to promote healthier dam passage in both directions. For the most part, though, I felt like this is a valuable exercise in life history, and it's really only the tip of the iceberg with what we can figure out about these fish, taking into account the gonadal fat reserves and how changes in that affect their life history. It was also kind of a shock to me because, as you saw, I started with 16,000 data points, 16,000 fish, but those were collected over the course of about 15 years, and the data are far from standardized. There were some collections where they did not assign sex, they did not weigh the fish, etc. So this is just a further reinforcement that for interjurisdictional fish, we need to be collecting standardized data. We're one of the few states that actually dissect fish and calculate GFBs and gonadal somatic indices, etc. But I think it's really important that we continue to enhance this and standardize this across the range. And then lastly, this simply just pointed the finger at some lesser known mortality and recruitment effects. All we really think about are fishing mortality, natural mortality, what's the recruitment potential for a healthy stock. But if 2/3 of your stock have rostrum amputations, then it's potentially a huge detriment to the reproductive potential of that stock. So it's really a call for looking at these stocks in a little more depth, and I will continue to collect data on this. I know I have other reservoirs to look at, so hopefully one day I'll finally finish this and give you some solid results. Questions? Go ahead.
Have you thought about putting transmitters in some of these fish that have, and maybe I missed that, I missed the first couple of slides of your talk, but it would be one of your final points there was that these fish the amputees, they may have a reduced migration distance.
Right.
Do you actually see that with the transmitter fish?
Not personally, no.
Okay.
The data I looked at were netting data from collections back to 2003. That's a valid question, though, and I'm kind of making some inferences based on the published knowledge with paddlefish, rather than do all the work myself, I guess.
Yeah, that's a valid assumption. I was just the
Yeah.
only reason that I asked is I thought it would be very interesting to do.
I agree.
So,
Sir?
How do you tell the difference when you're can you tell the difference between a dam passage injury versus like a propeller, boat propeller, or any other type of injury?
Excellent point, and I ignored that on purpose. I said it's a shipping lane, and we also saw that those 4 reservoirs had higher incidence. The simple answer is, when we're handling the fish, we pull them out of nets, the wounds are fairly characteristic. A prop strike is typically multiple wounds and is rarely just a clean rostrum cut. It's sort of hard to describe. It's more of like, technique, but we've handled thousands and thousands of fish, and the people I got the data from are also paddlefish experts, and they noted rostrum amputation. We would call it a prop scar or a prop strike.
So do you think it's when they're coming downstream, they're going over a spillway and then hitting the bottom of the spillway, or is it in the draft tube coming upstream? Would they be that deep?
It's everything. There's research that is out and is coming out talking about the shear forces and how the rostrum structure itself is vulnerable to breakage at that particular spot. So I can't go into a whole lot of detail, but yeah, fairly confident that it is spillway typically, and it doesn't necessarily mean the fish impacted an object. It can happen from shear forces.
We should talk afterwards. I have a little idea for you about shear.
Okay. Anyone else?